Space-based systems offer a timely and comprehensive understanding of military activities, empowering decision-makers to respond effectively. They act as a deterrent, signaling a country's readiness to defend itself and its allies. Satellite networks provide critical insights into potential threats, aiding in proactive defense strategies. However, they face security challenges from cyber and physical attacks. Space-based systems enable seamless global communication, connecting military personnel and equipment for coordinated responses. They also enhance navigation precision, guiding troops and vehicles in unfamiliar terrains. Discover the extraordinary capabilities of space-based systems, revolutionizing military operations and providing nations with a competitive edge in a changing world.
Back everyone, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Hisham, Regional Director Asia Pacific at Geospatial World. Pleasure to be here. And to introduce our third plenary, Advancing Space Infrastructure for Defense and Security. As per outlined in the video, this session aims to discuss the space infrastructure utility and applicability for defense and intelligence, security of space-based systems to physical and cyber attacks, space-based communication networks to connect military personnel and equipment across the globe, facilitating coordination and response times, and improve navigation to guide troops and vehicles, making it easier to operate in unfamiliar or challenging terrain. Now I invite our plenary speakers to come on stage. Our keynote speaker, Mr. Gary Duno, Senior Director from Maxar. Lieutenant General PJS Panu, PVSM, AVSM, VSM retired, Head of Aerospace Division from SATCOM India. Brigadier G. Manoj from Defense Space Agency, India. Mr. John Whitehead, Senior Director of Sales and Distribution APAC from Trimble. Mr. Pino Nobile, Head of Geospatial Section, Situation Center at NATO Headquarters. So welcome, gentlemen. And this session will be moderated by our colleague, who is also former Commander, Joint Aeronautical and Geospatial Organization in the UK, Mr. John Kedar. John served a career in the UK Armed Forces, including leading its geospatial capabilities. Subsequently, he was Director, International Engagement for UK's National Mapping Agency Ordnance Survey for 6 years, opening new international markets and building long-term intergovernmental relationships. John now works independently, supporting nations to prepare and deliver their national geospatial information strategies and action plans. This includes guiding developing nations through the SDG Data Alliance and as strategic advisor, geospatial infrastructure and agencies at Geospatial World. So John, over to you.
Good. Thank you very much, Sarah, for our introductions and for that very long-winded one about me. There's not that much in my history, but I am ex-British military and I am ex-geospatial intelligence, which actually gives me a little bit of a reason to be standing up here. Welcome to this first plenary session after lunch. And this one, as you've seen, is about advancing space infrastructure for defense and security. From a personal perspective, though, it's great to catch up with some colleagues and friends and meet new ones around the world. And I think that's one of the strengths of these sorts of regional events, is it brings people together with a common interest, but different perspectives. And we learn from each other. And there are many distinguished colleagues here in Delhi this week. I'm going to make 3 points to set the scene. And it's not the points that Sarah made. But I want to make 3 points. And I'm going to start by saying space is opening up many new opportunities, often actually driven by research, or driven by commercial, economic reasons, or driven through security needs. And there are 3 that are particularly relevant, I think, to the community here this week. Earth observation in all its forms, which is an important GeoInt source. And I include in that the work that we heard about from Hawkeye this morning. Communications, the need to communicate, and that enables better command and control in a defense and security environment. And then GNSS, the ability to have position, navigation, and time is now completely part of many of our military activities, and indeed many commercial and government activities. So space, to me, includes those three areas which are relevant to our conversation this afternoon. My second point is that this session is about advancing space infrastructure for defense and security. So it's forward-looking. It's not about what's happened in the past, it's what actually we are moving towards in the future. And space, to me, is not an isolated ecosystem. It's not space something different from everything else, because in the military, it's very much part of the joint environment. But actually, that jointery goes further. And it's not just about the data from space. It's not just about the positioning. It's actually about the tools and models that we use to turn all of this into something that enables us to make decisions, that actionable intelligence, that actionable understanding that enables us to make decisions. And the GNSS system is one of the great integrating tools, because to make decisions, we need to bring data in, information in, applications in from many different sources. And GNSS position is one of the ways that we integrate data. And of course, geographic information systems are classic in that world. But there are other ways of integrating data in our sort of human and cyber network-centric world. But integration requires the data, it requires standards, it requires sharing policies, it requires the different analytical tools, and I would add it requires diverse cultural perspectives, because we all look at things from a slightly different perspective, and that's a strength. Which brings me to my third of 3 points, and that is most conflicts are coalition in nature. Whether active coalitions fighting side by side, or actually the support, for example, we're seeing with Ukraine, munitions, equipment, intelligence, helping support the Ukrainians in their defense. Regional security requires regional collaboration. And given the importance of the Indo-Pacific to the world, that collaboration actually extends to trusted partners elsewhere in the world. And there are many of those in the audience here and attending this conference today. And our space infrastructure needs to enable this collaboration as much as anything else, and will probably be part of that collaboration. It's not new, of course. Collaboration has been going on for years and years and years in the GeoInt sphere, especially in areas like map making, map production, training, and so forth. And collaboration is also with industry, where a lot of innovations going on, a lot of new capabilities and tools are being developed that are absolutely applicable to defense and security. And I must say, I do congratulate Geospatial World on taking the step to build this forum into a regional event, because of exactly that point. Regional security comes from regional collaboration, and this event contributes to that collaboration. Our panelists today come from government, defense, industry, and one of the most successful collaborative alliances that we've seen, NATO, and I'll introduce each of them in turn when they speak. But first of all, we have a welcome video from Chirag Parikh, who's the Deputy Assistant to the President and Executive Secretary of the National Space Council in the United States of America.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be able to participate virtually with you at today's conference. This event is exceptionally well-timed given ongoing developments in India's space policy, the US-India bilateral relationship, and the region. I'd like to congratulate Sanjay Kumar, a world leader in the commercial space industry, and his team at Geospatial World on organizing yet another excellent space event. I'd also like to convey my best wishes to former director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and my former boss, Robert Cardillo, as well as everybody participating in this event. Now, my career has evolved around geospatial data from my days as an analyst using geospatial imagery, to running space policy in the Obama administration, leading the efforts for increased, improved, and resilient geospatial space capabilities, to my 4 years at NGA working for Mr. Cardillo, running collection operations and the application of geospatial sciences, to working in the private sector, taking advantage of the cloud and AI to process and analyze the large amount of geospatial data that we all see today. Today, I'd like to speak briefly about the changes in the global context for geospatial data, US policy, and how both of these factors relate to our cooperation with India and the Indo-Pacific region. Now, as attendees at this event know very well, the geospatial market is changing and diversifying rapidly. And long gone are the days where a user of geospatial data could easily take into account all the data being captured by geospatial satellites and other geospatial and locational sources. In addition to long-standing phenomenologies in the visual spectrum, we now have geospatial capabilities that are in other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, from synthetic aperture radar to radio frequency data to hyperspectral and infrared, and a huge quantity of non-imagery based geospatial data as well. We're also seeing major advances in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and cloud computing, all being brought to bear on geospatial data to power downstream applications. Indeed, the quantity and diversity of geospatial data being collected has created opportunities for all humankind, but new challenges for capitalizing on all this data, making it accessible, analyzing it, and enabling effective understanding of the data in a way that can support a range of downstream applications continues to be problematic. Seeking such effective understanding of this data is vital if we are to, as Vice President Harris says, connect the high tech to the low tech, so that these geospatial systems can be fully leveraged to help solve problems here on Earth, whether it's addressing the climate crisis, supporting agricultural production, promoting city planning and infrastructure development, responding to natural disasters, and of course, enhancing our national security. Now, on this last point on national security, we've seen the value of commercial geospatial data play out in the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, where we've seen verifiable evidence of military buildup, military operations, and damage and atrocities. Now, as the civil, commercial, and national security space sectors increasingly overlap, it's incumbent that we have effective policies and enabling resources to fully take advantage of both the opportunity and growth of geospatial data. As a Deputy Assistant to the President and Executive Secretary of the National Space Council, I directly work with the Vice President, who chairs our National Space Council, and enable our space policies to reflect the Biden-Harris administration's broader policy objectives. To achieve these objectives, we must have a council that represents our growing space enterprise. And now this includes those that you would expect, like the NASA Administrator, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of National Intelligence for national security purposes. This includes the Secretary of State for international partnership. But this also has other entities who use space information, such as the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Interior, who are members of the Space Council. And our council also includes those who enable our workforce, such as our Secretary of Education and our Secretary of Labor. And those who enable our commercial space enterprise are also represented here on the council, such as the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Transportation. Among the council's many tasks is developing and, very importantly, implementing our national space policies and strategies, as well as synchronizing the ever-growing civil, commercial, and national security space activities in furtherance of our objectives and policy. Our space policy is guided primarily by the President's 2021 Space Priorities Framework, and the policy highlights the need to maintain a vibrant space enterprise across all sectors and foster the policy and regulatory environment that enables a competitive and burgeoning U.S. commercial space sector. As space activities evolve, the norms, the rules, and the principles that guide outer space activities must also evolve. Irresponsible activities in space, government, commercial, or otherwise, can have a downstream effect on all space operations, from humans on the ISS to security, to economic and societal needs that rely upon space systems. This is why we've placed such an emphasis in this administration on the Artemis Accords, whose membership continues to expand. More and more nations continue to see that this non-legally binding commitment is in the best interest of not only their own nations, but also the long-term sustainability of peaceful exploration of outer space. And we hope nations continue to align themselves to what I believe is a set of non-controversial principles. Space sustainability is incumbent to how we can ensure continued benefits from geospatial systems in, through, and from space. This goes from mitigating debris generation to properly deorbiting satellites to cleaning up the space environment. So how does all of this relate to our cooperation with India in a bilateral context, as well as jointly in the Indo-Pacific region? First, geospatial data is a leading component of the US-India space cooperative efforts, and the United States and India are both world-class leaders in this area. Commercially, the annual bilateral trade in geospatial services is estimated at over $1 billion, and it continues to grow rapidly. On the civil side, India has hosted international ground stations for Landsat, and of course, as many people know, ISRO is preparing to launch the state-of-the-art NASA-ISRO synthetic aperture radar mission, NISAR, which will be the first radar imaging satellite to use dual frequencies. And on the security side, we previously signed a basic exchange and cooperation agreement for geospatial cooperation, also known as a BECA. Our respective policies on geospatial data are also coming closer into alignment. India's new national space policy notes the importance of enabling open data access from ISRO's remote sensing satellites, while laying out a clear data policy related to ground sampling distance. This dovetails with U.S. policy efforts, as well as with what the White House has announced as the 2023 being the year of open science, to promote open data and open science policies across our government and around the world. While geospatial data is a leading element of our current bilateral space cooperation, the U.S.-India partnership already goes far beyond geospatial to a range of other activities, including space exploration, the U.S.-India Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies that met earlier this year, as well as the Advanced Domains Defense Dialogue that met just last month in Delhi. And increasingly, we are deepening our bilateral cooperation in new areas, such as human spaceflight, while expanding our commercial space cooperation to new areas, thanks in large part to the changes called in India's new national space policy. I expect our bilateral partnership will continue to advance rapidly following the upcoming official state visit of Prime Minister Modi to the United States this month. We believe this visit will strengthen our two countries' commitment to a free, open, prosperous, and secure Indo-Pacific, and our shared resolve to elevate our strategic technology partnership, which includes in space. The National Space Council continues to lead U.S. international space partnerships, and we're thankful to our Indian counterparts for continued collaboration to ensure our highest levels of government recognize and encourage the value of space for our nations, our alliance, and for the world. Space in general and geospatial data in particular are also crucial efforts to our joint effort with India, Japan, and Australia in the Indo-Pacific as part of the Quad. Within the Quad, I chair the Space Cooperation Working Group for the U.S. side, and we were very pleased with the outcomes of the recent Quad Leaders Summit. In addition to continuing robust work on leveraging space to address the climate crisis and extreme weather events, the Quad leaders, for the first time, aligned on a shared commitment to open sharing of civil Earth observation data, expanding the group's work to commercial space cooperation, which I believe will have positive implications for our respective economies as well as the region. And our leaders announced their intention to share expertise and experience in space situational awareness. Space data also continues to provide strong support to other initiatives within the Quad, including the Climate Working Group and the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness. I hope that this event's proceedings will lead to a closer alignment on geospatial data programs, policies, and applications, as well as strengthen U.S.-India cooperation bilaterally in the region and through the Quad. We should also continue to keep in mind the broader policy context. Moving forward, we should think about how do we better align, integrate, and most importantly, implement respective national as well as bilateral policies on geospatial data, space, AI, and emerging technologies. I'm so proud of the strength of the respective nations. As someone born in India, as someone who is proud to serve in the United States government, and just somebody who loves space, I cannot be more pleased about all the work that you are trying to achieve and that you are doing. My best wishes to all, and sincerest thank you to everyone for allowing me to speak, and best wishes. Thank you.
Great, well, thank you very much, Chirag. He's not joined in for real, so we haven't got a chance to question him later. But I would like to now invite our keynote of the afternoon session, Mr. Gary Dunau. He's recently concluded a 37-year career in national security operations in the USA with the US Air Force and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, during which he focused on shaping operational concepts, policy, and technology efforts for coalition interoperability. He's recently joined Maxar Technologies as a senior director, continuing his passion for enabling coalition operations of US and international partners through innovative industry capabilities. Gary, over to you, please.
Thank you, John. Thanks for the introduction. And I'd like to thank and congratulate Sanjay and the team for this, the foresight and fortitude you had to put this event together. And I hope it becomes a springboard to many future successful events with a lot of action going forward. Before I begin my remarks today, I wanted to just acknowledge three biases I bring to the remarks. The first is, for those that know me, there's a few friends here, and I've been able to make some more friends and hope to do so over the next couple of days. But for those that know me, I am not much of a talker, and I am more of an action person. So a lot of the comments I have today, I hope will spur or nudge us into action, if not be a little provocative and cause some more interesting conversations. The second alludes to what John described in my introduction, and that is I am very new to industry, only 4 months with Maxar. I spent 20 years in the Air Force as a user of geospatial intelligence and a demanding user of geospatial intelligence, and 20 years in NGA serving for leaders like Robert Cardillo and others, spending most of that time trying to drive interoperability across our coalitions and our partnerships. And so most of my remarks will come from my experience as a government provider and influencer. And the last is a penchant for using the term interoperability rather than sharing. So I understand the theme of the conference is a shared vision, and we had a lot of conversation last night about sharing. But I've found in my experience, specifically over the last 10 to 15 years, is that sharing is just not enough to get us to where we need to be. Sharing is very temporal and transactional. And I feel like interoperability is more permanent and more relational. And if we want to get to the vision that this conference and others have espoused, we need to continue to develop those relationships and that trust in order to be able to move forward. So my responsibility for most of the last 20 years as a civil servant was to drive interoperability of what we called the GEON enterprise. Some of the efforts I helped lead in this direction included policy measures like the BECA that Chirag referred to, analytic transformation, developing a concept called object-based production, where we use the data to drive answers, and influencing disparate heterogenic architectures, both within the US and across our allies, trying to achieve a reduction of self-imposed latency based on the heterogeneity of the ecosystem. One reason I chose to join the commercial industry world, specifically Maxar, is because I saw that there was more opportunity from my perspective on the industry side of the house to drive that interoperability than there is in the government for a lot of different reasons, which I won't go into. Just suffice it to say that I recognize that there's more opportunity in industry, and I think we can move faster. So let me share a few thoughts based on where I think those opportunities sit. The first one is that GeoInt provides the opportunity to tell the truth from space through multi-source capabilities and multinational cooperation. Space-based capabilities are able to document and confirm the truth of stories in a way that counters propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation that is so prevalent in some nations today. Examples include documentation of war crimes in Bucha, military infrastructure buildup in the South China Sea, prison camps in North Korea, and there are many others. In the buildup to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the world was able to see daily images from Maxar and Planet and others of Russian battalions mobilizing on eastern borders of their sovereign neighbors in quantities that belied the narrative coming from the Kremlin. Commercial imagery providers were able to tell the story through various forms of media using clear, comprehensive imagery that national systems weren't able to provide as quickly or as easily. While these images swayed much of the world and NATO, to initiate action against Russia, it still wasn't enough to convince some nations' leaders or much of the Russian citizenry, even after the invasion began. Electro-optical imagery represents one form of space-based information that the average global citizen can readily interpret. However, to achieve the objectives we pursue, investments in multi-source capabilities are required to provide increased certainty for confirmation of what we can see, as well as basic abilities to sense where EO can't. Capabilities such as synthetic aperture radar, hyperspectral, IR, radio frequency, and other capabilities are necessary to provide the greatest clarity and veracity and tell the entire story as events unfold on the ground. Much of this has been discussed throughout the day. This is not true only in terms of providing transparent, truthful information to the citizenry, but it also applies to enabling military operations through commercial capabilities. A recent Atlantic Council panel that I participated in described 3 game-changing phenomena that are being demonstrated by ground combat operations in Ukraine. One of those is pervasive surveillance. Pervasive surveillance requires the space infrastructure investments in solutions beyond proliferated low Earth architecture. LEO is getting a lot of press. It's kind of the hot topic of the day, given commercial communications and remote sensing. But it's not the only orbit regime needed for national security. We need to think about not putting all of our eggs in one basket. And one should not automatically pigeonhole commercial solutions into LEO. Rather, we should look at which solutions can be adopted to missions that need to operate in other orbital regimes. The next point I'll make is about the role of tactical ISR, which was discussed by Andy Stevenson earlier. The role that we see in the Ukraine is not the same as the role it will play in the Indo-Pacific theater. In my experience during the counterterrorism fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw a heavy reliance on UAV platforms for tactical ISR capabilities, with continually improved tactics, techniques, and procedures that resulted in successful operations where our military operators had freedom of movement and were able to get the data they needed when they needed it. While UAV systems are playing a key role in Ukraine, it's evident that pervasive surveillance can only be achieved through layered capabilities that include space-based platforms being used as tactical capabilities. This is especially true in the Indo-Pacific theater, where the tyranny of distance has been a key factor in military operations for centuries. This requires a mental shift from pigeonholing commercial ISR into missions like foundation collection for mapping or for shareable strategic intelligence, into applications for tactical ISR, which is far more responsive and optimized to reduce latency. Naturally, reducing latency inherently requires inclusion of relevant technologies such as AI/ML, onboard compute for dynamic replanning, as well as edge processing to reduce data volumes and prioritize delivery of the relevant features to the end users, the data, not the pixels. The third point I'd like to make is that industry must be considered a critical complementary component to government programs, not a competitor to them and not separate from them. China doesn't distinguish between industry, academia, civil, and military capabilities. They look at them homogeneously within their ecosystem. The advantages of taking such approach have been clear since the early days of military modernization. Those advantages range from the speed of innovation to reduced investment costs for the government to seeing beyond the limits of years-old requirements definitions and greater interoperability. Some nations do this better than others. Some coalitions do this better than others. When done right, it creates synergy and a success that is often limited by the noble intent when bureaucracies go too far trying to optimize fairness and competition in the system. Those approaches that are necessary sometimes in order to obviate corruption and nepotism result in protracted requirements processes and program builds that fail to keep up with evolving threats and competitors' capabilities, thereby widening the gap between us and those that we're trying to keep up with. In other words, they create late-to-need environment and a vicious cycle of catch-up. Traditionally, governments do a poor job of actually assessing what can emerge from commercial solution space. It often guardrails either between being overly optimistic about what commercial can do or discounting out of hand what industry is capable of producing. That said, industry cannot approach government partners with bespoke solutions or the overall or portions of the overall capability that force the government to then go find the rest of the puzzle pieces to solve the problem. Industry should self-organize into capability consortiums, bringing solutions that support interoperability and demonstrate a sincere intent to drive mission effectiveness. The final point I'd like to make is that space infrastructure starts and ends with the ground. This includes people on the ground. We all quickly become enamored with the glamorous parts of the space infrastructure system, satellites and sensors. Everybody likes satellites and sensors. I've witnessed several program efforts, however, that invested significant funding in novel satellite and sensor capabilities or attempts to darken the skies with platforms, while the necessary corresponding ground architecture investments were either delayed, underfunded, or not funded, resulting in completely avoidable capability gaps. In my opinion, closing this gap in investment between space and ground has become even more critical because our decisive advantage has moved from the collection end of the TCPED paradigm to the dissemination end. We used to have the advantage in how much we could collect, what kind of things we could collect, but that's becoming more and more of a routine capability nowadays. And the answer, as was mentioned in the previous panel, is coming in how we fuse that data together, sift through it to find the one piece of data that matters to the troop on the ground or the decision maker in the government office. While the promise of AI/ML creates the image of nirvana, where machines in space and on the ground can do everything, the reality today is that AI/ML, in particular computer vision, has only partially delivered on that promise. Even those capabilities that have been delivered require regular maintenance and supervision by actual human beings who make sure that the system is doing its job. Therefore, proper investment in PED or ground segments of any space infrastructure program require investment in human beings who are the true differentiating capability of any program. Our governments generally start with their own capabilities and then try to see how industry can fit in to cover the gaps that the government can't provide. I'd propose, maybe a little provocatively, that we should flip that paradigm on its head and understand the scale of what industry can provide and then allow the government to reduce its investments to just what the government needs to pay for after that. I hope I've provided some thoughts for discussion for later on, and I look forward to the rest of the panelists and their remarks on this topic. Thank you for the time.
Great, thank you very much, Gary, and for your provocative thoughts, and for your points on layered capabilities and integration, which I think are really important in the context of coalitions that I mentioned earlier. Next, we are very honoured to have Lieutenant General PJS Panu. Of note, General Panu is currently the chair of the Aerospace Committee of SATCOM Industries Association of India, and chair of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry on ICT modernisation. He is a former commander of 14 Corps of the Indian Army and former Deputy Chief of the Indian Integrated Defence Staff Operations. And he initiated the raising of the Defence Space Agency here in India. He also writes on niche technologies, and he's co-authored a book, which I'm sure you can find on Amazon, called The Power of Future Machines. General, floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, John, for your kind introduction. Since yesterday, we've been debating on the geo-int in the Indo-Pacific arena. Now, the idea of Indo-Pacific is not a very old idea. It came up in about 2007. Columbus went to discover India, and 500 years plus, Columbus ended up discovering America. So it's taken 500 years that America now has discovered India. So once America has discovered India in 2007, I suppose now we talk about coming together and collaborating in various ways in Quad. And I suppose when you come together and collaborate, the industry collaborates, the nations collaborate, the collaborations collaborate. That is because there is an underlying interest. The two interests of two industries, the businesses have to come together. And also nations collaborate because the national interests are also coming together. And I suppose that is where we stand today, that the Indo-Pacific is basically because of the national interests of two countries coming together. And therefore, the trade and industry and commerce is also coming together. So therefore, that is the reason that we sit here together and talk about not only the space, but anything that brings us the geo-int for use for both peaceful and military purposes. The problem with integration is that it has to be based on integrity. You can integrate, but if there is integrity in doubt, then you don't integrate to a point of success. So as a result, when industry comes together, and more so when you're talking about warfare and competition in businesses and profits, you find that there is something where you have to have your own baseline, which is primarily yours. So a number of baselines come up. I think the first baseline is the nation-owned systems. You have to be complete as far as systems are concerned, have to be national. You cannot have lacunas and you cannot have glitches and you cannot have gaps in your national systems and completely rely on collaborations outside. Then it means that your coming together is very transactional, and the denial of service and disruption coming from somewhere is something which will never be able to make you sit together and talk even from the word go. The second baseline comes from the reinforcement by the collaborative systems. The collaborative systems have to be secondary in nature, but not primary. They cannot replace the nation-owned systems. However, the hybrid geo-int framework is the only way that the nations can bring together because they are cost prohibitive. The technology moves so fast that no one nation can afford to entirely build a system and continue to change. And secondly, the speed of warfare itself is so rapid that you have to face the shorter decision cycles. And shorter decision cycles would mean that you need systems to back up, which you can trust so that you can decide and act. As a result, when you're talking about the intelligence on the ground has to be translated into how you want to use this intelligence on ground. And literally speaking, today being the era of digital warfare, the battles are going to be won if you have mastered the technology to fight precision battles. The battles have to be precision-based from the precision systems which back you up, starting from the information, and then taking on to the actual targeting or the process of warfighting in which you have to analyze whether the profile of the adversary is offensive or defensive in nature. You can pick up something or the other from the adversary, but it will be very difficult for you to analyze as to what is the intent behind what the enemy is showing, because of a lot of cover of deception which is going to come in. So the reality and deception also got to be separated, because so much of deception in visible form, in electronic form, and in the form of information and psychological warfare, which is going to be thrown into it, it is quite easy that if our systems are making an assessment after all the information is available to you from the EO, SAR, RF, whatever you have, it all comes together, yet you will not be able to make out the difference between the virtual, real, or the deceptive pickups that your geo intelligence system is going to give you. So what is important is that when satellites are going to be used for information, you can have satellite as service and leave everything else to the user, that he brings the information or the data on the table, but the entire analytics can be left to those decision makers who would decide what to do. Because if the intelligence is processed and given to you, then you are entirely outsourcing the decision-making process to somebody else. So therefore, bringing all the elements together of technology, the precision battles are going to be based on C5, I2, star 2. It means command, control, communication, cyber, or whatever we are talking about, is information to intelligence. And then you have the surveillance target acquisition. And the reconnaissance is going to be also, there's another R to robotics, because rather than just depending on the raw information, I think edge computing, which of course, a lot of people are talking about, that the capacity is not there for satellites or the computers to do the entire processing on the other side. It is going to be very difficult for all the systems to work as we are talking about today. So therefore, a system which might look good in the peacetime may get completely disrupted or destroyed during wartime. It means that if an adversary's intent is to disrupt, he will not disrupt you during peacetime. He will make sure that systems work so beautifully, and at the nick of the moment, there will be denial of service. And I think that is the technological clutter that we have to prepare for. We have to prepare for technological chaos. And therefore, what I come down to is that if you are going to be faced with shorter decision cycles, there is no time to cut this clutter down. You have to be absolutely clear. You have to have the integration done through that kind of a trust that is to be built in our businesses and technology, in how the nations behave and come together. Why I'm saying all this is, Second World War has taught us that there was a race to Berlin by the two competing powers. And immediately on the termination of race to Berlin, the two who were actually competing to capture Berlin became adversaries, and that is how we set ourselves into Cold War. The German completely went into from where they were against to the Western side. And the Japanese, who were also collaborative, also went towards the other side. So what I'm saying is that Second World War was a watershed, that all those who were collaborating in warfare became opponents later. So how is this that the cycle of trust, as we are talking about the collaborative technologies and geopolitics of the nations coming together, would continue to remain the same? So therefore, it's going to be very difficult for us to decide on one side how much to rely on and how much to build yourself. I think these are the kind of forums where we have to sit together and decide how do we make sure that our national interests, which have come together, are protected, not at short time or medium, but long term. The Americans and the Indians, company-wise, commerce-wise, technology-wise, military-wise, actually, we are sitting on the opposite sides of the globe. And if we make a great union, I think from both sides, we can take care of the entire globe. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, General, and some very insightful remarks. And again, integration came up very strongly in your talk, especially in solving the problem of shorter decision cycles that we absolutely do need. I just wonder if Columbus needed better geoint in his day, and then maybe he'd have found India. I next want to welcome Brigadier G. Manoj to talk. He is a serving Indian Army officer and an alumni of the National Defence Academy. As an electronics engineer, he's headed equipment sustenance and maintenance operations at various levels in the Indian Army, and also served in a UN mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Brigadier Manoj is now Brigadier Space Force Enhancement in the Indian Defence Space Agency, and he's responsible for planning and provisioning of space-based services to the armed forces. Brigadier, over to you.
John, it's indeed an honor to be present as part of the esteemed panel, and must admit a bit overwhelming to be addressing this informed audience. Space today offers unprecedented opportunities for development and progress. Satellite technologies are used in modern society, often in very invisible ways. Whether you look at infrastructure, communications, transport, logistics, or even something mundane as ordering food to your home or paying your cab by UPI. Somewhere there's a satellite up there in action, sending data to the ground stations and its network. So space, therefore, probably has turned the world, the Earth, into a global neighborhood. As our dependencies grow, so do our vulnerabilities. And therefore, all nations probably need to invest in and develop robust space infrastructure to safeguard their interests, protect their citizens, and ensure their security. As Carl Sagan once said, somewhere something incredible is waiting to be known. Indeed, the vast expanse of space holds secrets and opportunities that can greatly enhance a nation's security. This is a snapshot of how I'll take you through the talk. Let's look at the evolving nature of warfare itself. General Pannu dwelled on it a bit. It is needed to better understand the requirement of space in security. Today, the lines between friend, foe, and a neutral are blurred. The traditional thought process of alliances, blocs, all of them are changing. Today, maybe a China is brokering peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which was unimaginable earlier, probably motivated by its own energy security. Another irreversible norm is the role of non-state actors. We can't wish them away. Hybrid war lends itself to hybrid war. It's not your typical force versus force. Basically, it is addressing the vulnerabilities where they exist of democracies or institutions. So, as we've seen amply in the ongoing Ukraine war, satellite-based technologies have turned easily both accessible by commercial and military usage. Now, what do we actually mean by space services? Space services would refer to any type of support that space assets can provide for the military operations. Space infrastructure possibly encompasses the wide range of capabilities to provide these services. Now, as we all know, the space services have the ability for a global reach, and we can have constant coverage and surveillance of the entire planet, therefore making it the ultimate high ground. Oxymoron, but yes, space remains the ultimate high ground. Typically, therefore, Military services, space-based services are classified into ISR, the position navigation timing for precision navigation, targeting, satellite communications, which is possibly the essence of any command and control, something which is not generally understood by a working soldier, a terrestrial based soldier, would be the space situational awareness. It covers the space weather detection, modeling of the movement of satellites and other space objects in order to understand what the opponent can see and do, and ability to detect threats to our own systems. This is crucial for safeguarding not only our own nation's satellites, also for identifying any enemy hostile action. Countermeasures are all about protecting own space assets and denying satellite support to adversaries' military or civilian populations. It is not merely the elimination of satellite systems for destruction's sake. All the above mentioned capabilities, they've been actively demonstrated in the Russian-Ukraine war. GPS-guided weapons such as HIMARS have been used to hit targets with great precision. Satellite-based monitoring has made the battlefield possibly the most transparent in history. And the Russian cyber attack on Viasat just prior to their actual operations crippled the organizations in the entire Europe. Now, building a resilient space infrastructure is paramount. Redundant systems and robust networks ensure continuous operations. To establish comprehensive infrastructure, these are some of the issues. They are not exhaustive by any means. The assembly, integration testing, ground control stations, spaceport for launching of vehicles, all these facilities are the infrastructure which will be required by any nation to address their space security. Now, the development in satellite technologies, their use also fosters new combination of capabilities that can be used for military purposes. Most of these are dual-use technologies. A consequence of the war also has been the degradation of trust between nations in the space domain. The ISS, Russia pulling out of ISS is one of the direct fallout. Therefore, the countries now are increasingly looking to protect their own sovereignty by getting these technologies through individual or by regional initiatives. These technologies, mostly dual used, they are developed apparently for benign use, but they do have the potential for being used offensively also. As highlighted, the impact is on large population and affects the common man. Of course, all these capabilities come with a price tag, but the cost of not leveraging space services for our armed forces could be even higher. So how can we leverage the potential? We could just have a look. We need to invest in the development and deployment of space assets. I'm right now purely speaking as a military man. We need to do it for defense usage. We need to develop new technologies. Some of them listed, the 3 dots or 4 dots at the end of ISL implies that they're just the beginning. It's just an indicative list. We also need to improve our ability to integrate these space services into our military operations. The US has been at it for long. We are a younger organization. We are evolving, and I'm sure we will get there. Finally, we need to collaborate, continue with our allies and partners to ensure that we can maximize the potential of space services for our collective society. Military space strategy is a work in progress, which will come up in due course of time. The Russia's war against Ukraine since 24th of February last year, has been described as the first two-sided space war. The space domain has been used in an ever agile and a flexible manner. In particular, the importance of commercial and private resources in utilizing the space domain has also been highlighted. The war also has shown us that owning space assets is as crucial as having access to them. Space infra is an essential component of the nation's security apparatus, and we need to invest. It could well turn out that the flashpoints for future conflicts may not be in West Asia, Taiwan, Iran, or Kashmir. It could well start in space. So the global common of outer space is a factor which everyone will need to look at for their national security. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Brigadier, and thank you for sort of giving us an insight into your thinking here from an Indian military perspective as well. Really interesting for us. I'd like to turn now to John Whitehead. John Whitehead is the Senior Director of Sales and Distribution Asia Pacific for the company Trimble for their Geospatial division. John works closely with his customers and distribution partners to deliver geospatial solutions across a range of different sectors, but including defense. In addition, he leads the commercial strategy development for the region and collaborates with the marketing and engineering teams in Trimble to improve the solutions for customers here in the Indo-Pacific. John, over to you.
Thank you. Can I have my slides, please? Good afternoon, everyone. Ooh, tough crowd. We need the coffee. Good afternoon. Okay. I thought I would give you guys a snapshot of some of the work that Trimble does with defense, the defense community globally, but in this presentation, I'm going to pick on, or actually just focus on, some of the work we do with the United States defense organizations, primarily because it's all in the public domain and I can share it with you. But we've been engaged in the defense industry pretty much ever since our emergence as a company, and I'll get to that a little bit more at the end of my talk. So 2 parts. One, to show you sort of what we're doing today and where we are, and then on the back half of the presentation, to talk a little bit about additional things that we can think about and where we can go with space-based technology, yes, also combining space-based technology with other spatial technologies. So first, our roots in Trimble being in the survey space and really coming out of being a pioneer in GPS and then further into GNSS. We are working very closely with all of the major branches of the military in the United States, not only within our own borders, but also globally. And we have a very close partnership with the United States Corps of Engineers, because one of the biggest roles that we play as a technology provider in the defense sector and in the national security space is actually in the development and the securitization and preservation of critical infrastructure. So if you look at a lot of the applications that we're really focused on, you'll see that in this list, or in this diagram, a huge majority of what we're focusing on is critical infrastructure. And some of that for military use, but also some of that for civilian use that the military would look after and preserve. And we really like to focus on the idea of having an ecosystem. In the commercial realm, in the private sector, we're opening that up to an open system where you can leverage capabilities of the cloud, where you can get better decision making in real time on a project. But in the military, in some cases, that system needs to be closed. And so we're adding that, we're enabling that capability with our technology so that we can kind of do both. In places where we're going to have people collecting data on the ground, say with the laser scanner, with a robotic total station, with the GNSS, a base station or a rover, with very good in-field software that's enabling a lot of decision-making to be made in the field during the time of collection, but then flowing that through to an office environment where that data can be processed, not only processed, but also shared with a number of different stakeholders on any given project. And so that may be surveyors, that may be geospatial professionals, but a lot of times it's with engineers that may have very little knowledge of geospatial technology to start with, but have a mission, a job that they need to do. And really where we're going, our vision is eventually is sort of sensor fusion. And so in this diagram, you'll see kind of one of our recent collaborations with Boston Dynamics, wherein we're putting our sensors and our software and integrating them with Spot the Dog, this is their robot, to be able to go in an unmanned, into an environment unmanned in collaboration with a person. But these systems are including autonomy technologies, obviously robotics, GNSS for positioning, as well as other sensors for positioning, and the purpose of which is to go in and collect data, find out information, bring it back, and do that same workflow that I just talked about. The office software environment is actually pretty critical. We probably don't give it enough attention because it gets to be a little bit boring going through every single thing that an office software environment will do. But again, going back to all those different stakeholders that are consuming that data, you're processing all of the information that you're getting in the field. And then hopefully, if your tools and your software are really good, in the case of Trimble Business Center, we're adding in things like machine learning and different AI tools for automated extraction of things that I need to make action, to take action and make decisions. So where are we headed? I mean, I think the idea of data fusion, I really like the note about being interoperable as opposed to just sharing. So data fusion is a form of interoperability where we can take different data types, raster, vector, point cloud, and we can combine them to make decisions. And with the advent of machine learning coming online over the past 10 to 15 years, we're able to do a lot of things with those data types that will expedite the process of making decisions and taking more efficient action. And so in this diagram, just talking about putting into a model something that we're looking for, in this case, a patch out of an existing map, and then have that trained model go and look for those things. And every time it finds one, it has a location signature. So I think everybody here is saying, yeah, we've seen stuff like this. But if you take it forward into an application, for example, like you're looking for a landmine, things get a little bit more serious because there are a lot of different types of landmines. They're difficult to find. And so if you go back to the example that I was giving about the robotic dog and the sensors that it's going into the field with, you can combine that sensor fusion and that capability with this type of machine learning detection, and you get a solution that, one, it's a lot safer, right? Two, it's probably a lot faster to find, and three, I think that opens up a lot of different opportunities for, in addition to this application, there's hundreds and thousands of different types of things that you want to go and look for and make decisions on without having to send somebody into the field to go and get it. So another example, this is just in the context of, I was talking about the war in Ukraine, where infrastructure was intact and being utilized by either side and then is damaged. And in that process, it may be the case that you want to continue to use that infrastructure. I remember the early days of the war when, Russia was making a beeline to Kyiv, and all of a sudden everything got stuck up. In part, that was because some of those roads and some of those bridges were taken out. Now, going the opposite direction, we want to actually not reinstate, but we want to put those infrastructures back to work for the Ukrainian military, and these types of tools, again, going out, collecting the data, scanning the area that's been impacted by this, by a bomb or a mortar shell, whatever, figuring out what is the change, and then actioning that for people that have nothing to do with this data. For example, an engineer that needs to figure out what volume of earth they need to move into this site so that they can repair the road and get on with it. The speed at which that happens is going to enable a lot more success. If the faster we can make those decisions, the faster we can move and mobilize. I'm not coming from a military background. You guys know this better than I do. Machine control also I wanted to touch on, because machine control for any part of the military that's going to be out building roads, you know, the thing about this is I think machine control is in and of itself for controlling bulldozers, graders, scrapers, all different types of paving systems. This is not a new technology. It's been around 10 plus years. But the thing about it is that every army has a budget, right? And every army has a budget and wants to do 10 things, and it only has budget to do 5. So when we think about investing in space, in technology that's space enabled or space technology enabled, we can also think about it from a commercial standpoint. Are we more efficient using these tools? Yes. Are we saving money using these tools? Yes. Are we actually getting to a point where we can then take further action if we're doing this in a conflict zone? Yes. So the benefits of machine control, in this case grade control, there's some of the commercial data here on the cost savings, but this is also an area that we can look at. Final point, this is one of our very earliest GNSS receivers. Trimble really wasn't doing anything between around 1978 until the first Gulf War. But when the first Gulf War hit, the US military started to use, this is called the Transpac, it was a Trimble receiver. This one was recovered from a helicopter that was shot down. We didn't know at that time how to ruggedize our equipment, how to make our software really that useful for the military. We did our best on the fly, but the point of showing this slide is that I think private industry, certainly Trimble, we definitely want to work with the governments represented in this room here. We can learn from each other, we can make each other better, and we definitely, I think, have a shared mission. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Sanjay, and your team. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, John. And actually what it told me and what it reminded me is that, back to that word integration again, it's not just space assets, is it? It's the ground, it's the other sensors that might have valuable information that can feed into what we do. So I want to, as our last speaker, move on to Pino Nabil, who works for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in the headquarters as head of the Geospatial section there. And NATO is one of the world's most successful security alliances. And John, in his 18 years, has witnessed and contributed to some of NATO's major challenges in Afghanistan and now with Ukraine. It's a real privilege to have John here, and we thank your Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence, David Cattler, for allowing you to come. Over to you, Pino.
Thank you, John. And most importantly, thank you to Geospatial World for the kind invitation. It was well received by NATO. You will see in a moment how NATO is looking at more global partners within the Indo-Pacific area. We live in a more dangerous competitive world. Our values of freedom, of democracy, and the rule of law are under pressure. In February last year, as many speakers have already mentioned, when Russia decided to invade Ukraine, and NATO knew that they were going to do that, we precisely knew they were going to attack. It was basically a huge shock. And probably not that much of a shock for Eastern Europeans, because knowing Russia historically, they knew that this imperial instinct in Russia never dies. but especially for Western European friends and allies and members of the European Union and NATO. So as I said, Russia war aggression against Ukraine green zone. We are still here today. Authoritarian regimes in Moscow, Beijing, and elsewhere are openly challenging the rules-based international order. And security threats, from terrorism to nuclear proliferation, cyber attacks, and climate change, are rising. And actually, we will see in a moment, I'm going to talk about how all those threats have actually been captured by the head of states by agreeing last year at the summit with our new strategic concept. So these common challenges require a common response. This is why NATO is deepening our partnership, including with our highly valued Indo-Pacific partners. You are all aware that we have a well-established partnership with Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. These countries may be far away from alliance territory, but as our NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said, security is not regional, it is global. Transatlantic security matters for Asia-Pacific security and vice versa. As a matter of fact, last year, and for the first time, leaders of these 4 Indo-Pacific countries were invited to attend the NATO summit. And now, as I mentioned, the NATO summit last year, where the new NATO strategic concept was approved, so our strategy and vision for the next decade to come, you can find actually all of the 47 articles of this new strategic concept online. You will notice how the alliance for over 74 years has evolved, has changed. From the threats that was facing back in time, at the time of the Cold War, when actually just a small group of nations on the 4th April 1949 decided to establish this alliance. The new strategic concept actually is kind of derived from the independent report of experts that the Secretary General appointed back in 2020. We were in COVID period. And that was actually triggered by the French president that actually wanted to shake the alliance. And the independent the group of experts appointed by the Secretary General in November 2020 delivered a report where actually captured the space, captured China, the rise of China, and all these other threats, including climate change. All those have been captured in the NATO new strategic concept. I heard a lot about space. It is the topic of this panel. I also happen to be the program manager in NATO headquarters in Brussels for the new strategic space situational awareness system since NATO declared space as an operational domain in December 2019. Let me just read one small statement from the strategic concept, Article 45 of the 49 articles. Sorry, I said 47 a moment ago by mistake. At Article 45, we state, so this is approved and agreed by all of the head of states, the NATO members. The Indo-Pacific is important for NATO, given that development in that region can directly affect Euro-Atlantic security. We will strengthen dialogue and cooperation with the new and existing partners in the Indo-Pacific to tackle cross-regional challenges and shared security interests. So we have this in our strategic concept. And it won't take you much time going on internet. and spot a number of interventions that just a few days ago, we talked about 4 weeks ago, on the 3rd of May, on the 21st April, so we are really talking recently, high officials from NATO, like the NATO Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, have made publicly with reference to the Indo-Pacific area. And more specifically, I just would like to refer to one that caught my attention. So just 4 weeks ago, on the 3rd of May, the NATO Deputy Secretary General, speaking at the Milken Institute Global Conference, stated that when we talk to our friends from the rest of the world, from India, from South Africa, from Nigeria, from Brazil, sometimes we tell them is the self-evident truth that Russia is a huge aggressor, that they have broken every single principle of the UN Charter, that you don't invade an innocent nations and pretend nothing has happened, that they have the right to spheres of influence. So what we will have to do much better job of is to talk with more humility, listening more to the concerns and the complaints of the rest of the world that has now is also trying to find a balance in a changing world. So, ladies and gentlemen, and as I approach, as my time is coming up, I just would like to stress that security in this area, that's what the Alliance feels, security in the Indo-Pacific area will impact the transatlantic security, and as the Secretary General stated, and vice versa. So we are happy to be here. We accepted the invitation with pleasure, and there is a lot of work to be done. I'm not going to repeat on a lot of principles that all the other distinguished speakers have mentioned in terms of sharing information. I heard this several times today about we need to share, in particular the keynotes from this morning, sharing information, sharing intelligence as much as possible. This area is particularly busy in terms of maritime domain, but we also recognize how much is happening at the moment above the Kármán line, so in the outer space, in the space domain, which becomes an operational domain. A number of nations are launching extensive number of satellites, and those are not just for civilian purposes. So we definitely want to understand what happens in space. We want to understand what happens in the undersea world. I heard also the reference to choke points. The Secretary General also took another initiative early this year. On March the 1st, he appointed a special coordinator for the critical undersea infrastructure. And as I speak, we have one of the key digital hubs here in this area, if I'm not mistaken, is in Mumbai. So whatever happens far away from the transatlantic area, even if it happens in the Pacific, it will impact the alliance. So that's why we are looking at a more of a 360-degree approach to security. And with that, thank you for listening and for your time.
Thank you, Pino. One thing you can't see in the audience is the clock that ticks down from 10 minutes to time's up. And Pino was dead on 0000. He hit it spot on. But actually, thank you as well for talking about your point on NATO's interest in the Indo-Pacific. I think that's a really important point for the audience here. Now, we don't have much time left, but we do for a couple of questions of the panel. And I've got a couple that I'd like to ask and see if I can generate some answers. We've heard a lot about Ukraine from some of the speakers this afternoon and this morning. But in terms of from a strategic perspective, from a strategic space perspective, is there anything else that you'd like to draw out that is relevant to the way we go ahead in the Indo-Pacific with the way we use space. Is there anything in particular that's caught your eye that you think we should be bringing into our concepts? And I'm going to start this one with the serving military officer, if I can, Brigadier, if perhaps you've got a view on that.
What I would like to highlight, especially in the terms of Ukraine conflict, the use of space. What it's brought out very, very clearly is the blurring line between commercial and military specific domains as far as space is concerned. Second part is the reliance of specifically the Western nations on the satellite-based services makes them equally vulnerable. That is a point that everyone needs to understand. In the Indo-Pacific region, where the adversary may not be Russia, China is building up its capabilities in an exponential manner. Mostly, they give a benign sort of this thing, rendezvous proximity operations and other things. However, we need to, in the Indo-Pacific region, especially for the space security of our own space assets, redundancy and resilience is one part which I would say is extremely important.
Okay, thank you very much. And if I have time, I will come back to security because it's another point that's been made very strongly. In the UK, one of the things, and it may have been caused by the fact there was so much commercial satellite imagery out there, is the Defence Intelligence, MOD's Defence Intelligence Agency, actually was briefing the public on what was going on in Ukraine in a way that they had never done so before. And so it created a sense of openness from defence intelligence that hadn't happened before. And Pino, I just wonder if from a NATO perspective you saw anything similar and whether it's resulted in more openness from NATO.
Yes, absolutely. Like everyone has already pointed out, the conflict in Ukraine has made a lot of nations, a lot of actors think about how conflicts are conducted recently. We have seen a lot of use of commercial satellite imagery and with the purpose, with a very strategic purpose. So to basically fight the disinformation campaign. So basically the satellite imagery, commercial satellite imagery provided also to news agencies actually helped to prove to the public what was happening on the ground, as opposed to what official statements were made. We, as a NATO, we have leveraged basically every possible resource. So we stand with Ukraine, like the Secretary General said, in many public addresses, and there is a new space race, as we refer to. So there are a lot of commercial actors out there, and we basically welcome the possibility to cross-reference information. So that's very important. But the conflict there is also brought to our attention how something, if I think about the last operation that NATO had in Libya in 2011, from March until end of October in 2011, the Operation Unified Protector, or UP, it was different. There were not so many drones flying at the time. So we see that conflicts now rely a lot on these new technologies, the impact of smartphones, social media, and drones, all put that together. It really makes us think how we should adapt our countermeasures and basically make sure that we can also deny access to those resources.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And actually, your last point brings me on to something I would want to turn to you, if I may, General Pano. And it's a point the Brigadier made about protecting space assets in a number of different ways. How practical is it to protect space assets? going forward, because clearly there's a necessity, but how practical, how realistic is it? I welcome your views on that.
When you talk about the threat to the space assets, we have been talking about the kinetic and the non-kinetic. I think as far as kinetic is concerned, it is more of a deterrence. But I think it's not practical to have many constellations being destroyed together because there is so much of interconnectivity and network that goes on. So therefore, the Chinese are building capability to interrupt temporarily into operations and also use high power microwave interference, ground-based or space-based, to actually nullify the functioning temporarily or for a longer period by the Chinese. So this proximity electronic emission or the directed energy weapons, of course, I suppose are being used, but the number of satellites which are now being thrown up into the space are going to be so big, it is going to be very difficult to target so many of them together. So I suppose, yes, to protect them, you can only go by maximum numbers or also create a counter deterrence to make sure that if your space assets are targeted, then you should have the capability of having a counter force to target somebody else's space asset. So it is tooth versus tooth. I think here the Chinese are going to learn more lessons than anybody else where the Ukraine conflict is concerned. And I think in the commercial part of the warfare, which happened much later in Ukraine, I think the Chinese might use the commercial aspect first as far as Taiwan is concerned. And that is where I suppose Indo-Pacific concerns would come in, that the larger number of commercial military applications would come in, which might go unnoticed when the next campaign starts. So I think a lot of lessons are being learned how to handle the next war. And I suppose that is where some amount of preparation is required.
Good, and I'd like to continue the discussion, but actually my clock is ticking away here as well. And it's been a really interesting session this afternoon. 5 very distinct and different panelists with different backgrounds and from different walks of life. I was very taken actually by Gary's point, his challenge almost, about how in democracies, industry and government, the way they work together could be looked at differently in order to give us more of an edge. And I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying it's an interesting point for people to perhaps discuss over coffee. And I also wonder about coalitions with space infrastructure, how we work in a coalition sense with our space infrastructure. And again, something that no doubt people are talking about in the sidelines. But I'd like to thank our panelists, those that are in the room, Gary Duno, Lieutenant General Panu, Brigadier Manoj, John Whitehead and Pina Nabil. And also I'd like to thank Chirag Parikh over in Washington for his contribution. So would you please join me in thanking the panelists?